Hello, my name's John Smith. I've been an examiner and fieldwork moderator, fieldwork advisor for a number of different exam boards for many years. I've entered many students for individual studies in the past, although I'm not actually involved with teaching them myself now. What I would like to do in this talk is to talk to lower six students, particularly lower six students who are planning their individual studies, and suggest, first of all, how you set up and how you carry them out. So, before you start, you have to realize that the coursework inquiry, the non-examined assessment, is worth 20% of all your A-level marks. 20% of marks can make a difference of a whole grade, 2 grades, even 3 grades at a pinch. But more than that, it's your part of the course, the bit that you own, the bit that you are in complete control of. And therefore, it should become particularly important to you. I've known many students who've gone for interviews at university or gone for job interviews, and they've been asked to talk about something that has really interested them in their course. And because it's their own thing, they've talked about their fieldwork, about their non-examined assessment. And if they can do that, when they've done that, and talked about it with enthusiasm, and talked about it with real understanding, and talked to the interviewer as if I know something that nobody else has done. This is mine. And it can give them such a boost in the interview. And well, I think that can make all the difference. As well as contributing to your exam mark, it can make the difference between getting jobs, getting placed at colleges and universities, and so on. But in the past few years, with COVID, with lockdown, with all the problems we've been having, things have been difficult. You know how difficult it's been for you. It's been difficult for your teachers, and it's been difficult for the exam boards. They've been having to respond in a situation that's been continuously changing. So, in 2020 and 2021, when you were taking your GCSEs, probably, the results were strange. They were unusual. They were based not on exams, not on coursework, but on teacher assessments. And this did make them different. In years 10 and 11, when you were there, you missed some teaching time. You probably missed some. I put most of. I could have put, you might well have missed all potential fieldwork experience. And then in the 7 months of your year 12, which have gone on so far, you've probably missed more time. So your fieldwork, or it's been non-existent. So problems. In 2020, A-level results were also strange. Again, they were based on teacher assessments, and they were different from the exam board assessments. In 2021, the results were even stranger, as I'm sure you know. In 2022, Ofqual, that's the government agency that runs the whole exam system, they hope they'll start to be less strange. Now, when I say less strange, I mean, really, they want to get them back down to where they were in 2019. The pass rate went up in 2020 and it went up further in 2021. And Ofqual want to bring the standards down to what they call normal in the next few years. Certainly in 2022, to some extent, and even more in 2023, when you lower six students are probably going to be entering. So, I don't know, that puts extra pressure on you. Don't worry too much about that, because it'll be the same for everybody in your year. in your cohort. Your results will still be comparable across all the results at that stage. It's just that they won't be directly comparable with the 2021 results. So be prepared for that. But the boards and Ofqual are doing everything they can to make sure that they're fair across the whole cohort. Now, in 2020 and 2021, the teachers' A-level geography grades, their estimated grades, were supposed to include some consideration of the non-examined assessment. It was never made entirely clear just how it should be done. So some schools did it one way, some schools did it another way. Some schools paid a lot of attention to the NEA and others paid minimal attention to the NEA. It was left entirely to them. Now, in 2022, the A-level geography grades will almost certainly include assessment of the NEA fieldwork-based inquiry. When I say almost certainly, well, I'm as certain as can be that they will leave that in, unless a total disaster happens in terms of COVID reappearing, but it doesn't look likely. Now, some allowance is going to be made in 2022 for disruption during the COVID crisis. But in 2023, Ofqual are going to reduce that allowance for disruption, even though it's your cohort that suffered particularly badly in your fifth form, your lower sixth, and maybe in your upper sixth as well. So your year won't be normal. All fieldwork training has been disrupted for 3 years, so you all have to be resilient. That is, you have to respond and be strong, whatever the circumstances. You've been hit in lots of different ways. You've had to be resilient getting through your GCSE year and getting through your lower sixth year so far. And you've survived it. You've done okay. You must have done to get to this stage. So you've shown that resilience. And really, when you look back on it, years from now, you might think, you know, what I experienced during COVID, it was tough, but it made me tough. Well, I hope so. That's resilience. You've got to be prepared. You've got to be prepared for whatever happens to you. And I hope in this session, I can help you prepare. And you've got to be flexible. Things are going to keep on changing, hopefully less seriously. There'll be fewer fluctuations, but you have got to be ready to respond to different circumstances. Now, according to the spec, the syllabus, the guidelines that have been sent out by Ofqual, you all should do 4 days group field work before you start your own NEA. Or you should do 4 days group field work, and in that 4 days, you should be thinking about your NEA. But in those 4 days group field work, you should have learned techniques to collect data, physical geography or human geography, or a combination of both. You should have learned techniques of measurement, techniques of interviewing, techniques of recording, and so on. And then you should also have thought about how to process and present the data and to analyze the data. And probably you'll have thought about the types of issues that you might set, the titles that you might set for your own individual studies. Some centres, some schools, take their group out and they do a practice inquiry, and then they expect all their students to develop an individual study in that general area. Other centres, other schools, other teachers expect their students to choose entirely where the students do a whole series of different investigations, none of which are directly linked to the studies that they did on their 4 days group field work. It's up to the centre, it's up to the school themselves. And I suppose even if the school does encourage everybody to do a similar piece of field work based on their group field work, individual students can say, actually, I don't want to do that. I've got ideas of my own. And I hope that schools will encourage them, even if they're a bit left field. Okay, the teachers will need to guide them maybe, but I always think there's a student who can choose his or her own topic, something that really enthuses them. They're going to work harder than there's somebody who's pushed into something by the teacher, or guided into something by the teacher, should I say. Now, your 4 days practice work may not be possible this year. The lockdown rules seem to have gone now, but school policy may still say that you're not going to be allowed out to do those 4 days field work. Hopefully, teachers will be able to argue with their school management to say, well, the spec says, the syllabus says, we must do those 4 days. This is worth 20% of our final mark. We have to go out and do that. But then the management come back and say, but giving you time out disrupts all the other subjects. And there's got to be that negotiation between your geography department and the management. I hope you all get to do your 4 days. But if you don't, I hope you get to do some practice in and around your actual geography lessons, in the classroom or in the immediate vicinity of the classroom. So, even before you start, flexible, prepared, resilient. Just like your teachers are going to have to be flexible, prepared, resilient. And hopefully your school management will be flexible, prepared, and resilient to help you fulfill what the syllabus says you ought to do, what government policy says you ought to do. So, could you do, as a flexible response, could you do an NEA in the school grounds? When I was teaching in a school, we had some tennis courts in the school, some hard. Over a 4 or 5 year period, the hard surface got broken down by plants growing in it. And that hard surface became almost a testing ground for the development of an ecosystem. We had students who did studies over their 2-year A-level course, this as a class, but they could have done this as individual studies, of the development of an ecosystem on bare ground. We've had students who've done studies of infiltration rates in different parts of school grounds under different circumstances, infiltration rates along places that became natural footpaths, you know, where there isn't actually a footpath built, but where everybody takes the shortcut and the grass gets worn down and the soil gets hammered down, comparing infiltration rates there with infiltration rates on the surface in flower beds or under the grass in a sports field, or under grass in ceremonial areas where nobody ever goes. Or we did studies just outside the school grounds of traffic flows around the school. So there are all sorts of things that you could do in the school grounds. That's even if you aren't allowed out, showing flexibility, showing resilience. Could you use your own class or another school class as a data source? Just suppose you want to see how COVID had affected travel patterns in the area. And supposing in your class, your lower sixth class, you had 15 colleagues, and you asked each of your colleagues to go home and interview a parent, or give their parent or both parents or carers or their uncle who lives next door or whatever, to give them a questionnaire on their travel patterns before lockdown, during lockdown, and after lockdown, just to see how much the lockdown affected their travel patterns. And then those students could all give you their data, and that would be primary data that you collected. I mean, you're giving it out to people to do the collection, but it was your data, it was your source of data. It would be primary data. I can't think of anything else just to offhand use your class. Supposing you're in a very small sixth form group, there are only 4 of you. Well, do the questionnaires, ask your teacher if he would introduce you to a year 9 class lower down the school, and take those questionnaires and give them out to the year 9 class and ask them to take them home and do it for homework. You'd need a cooperative class, you'd need a cooperative teacher, but that other class could then become a data source. Of course, there are problems. That group of parents may not be a typical cross-section of the population as a whole. But you had to choose that cross-section because that was all that was available to you. Well, explain that in your write-up. But it's a way of thinking differently about collecting data. Or could you use your family and neighbours as a resource? Supposing they're planning to build a new, I don't know, a new shopping centre near you, or a new sports club, or put a 20-mile-an-hour limit along your street, or close a car park, build on a car park, whatever, any local issue. You could then use your family and neighbours as a resource, again, for doing questioning, for interviewing in depth, or to do a questionnaire. And without travelling far, you could put them through their letterboxes, do it with people you know, do it with people who you know are going to reply to you, or who you can reasonably go round and nag them if they don't give them back at first. Give them a prod, give them a, well, you don't need to go round to them. You can do it over the internet. Some people have local street Facebook groups or whatever. I'm not up to date on social media, but there are all sorts of ways of getting to people through social media. Again, without running any COVID risks, without taking time out of school. Another opportunity for being flexible, think, could you do your NEA on the effects of lockdown or recovery from lockdown? Could you go down a local shopping street now, when we're just coming out of lockdown, and see what's happening on that shopping street? Make a record of the number of shops that are closed, the number of shops that are on part-time, the number of shops that this, that, and the other, and then go down in 3 months or 4 months and do that similar study and to see how it's changed. Has the area recovered from COVID and from lockdown? Or has it maybe suffered so much from the lockdown that it never recovers? There are other ways of studying a changing street or area of the town or village. Could you choose an area near you that has undergone change in the past or is undergoing change now? My good friend and I have done a study of a street through time. Well, my good friend Liz Cowans has done a really good study of a street through time. She's taken an area in Newcastle called the Ousburn Development Area. She's taken a street down that, in that development area, and she's studied, I don't know how many of you seen A House Through Time, the program on BBC television that takes a house over the last 200 years and studies through documents and so on, who's lived there and what they've done and so on. It's been brilliant. Well, Liz's street through time, she takes this street that in the 1960s, in the 1860s, was starting to industrialize, starting to become developed with a whole range of industries. By the 1880s, it had become really intensively industrialized with a big influx of population, with a whole series of industries that are all interrelated. And she studied that street and then followed it through to the present day, taking several themes, particularly the effect of pollution on one particular area, and the way this has had to be dealt with to modernize the area. And it's brilliant. And we're presenting that, or Liz is presenting it, through the Tyne and Wear GA on the 22nd of March, later this month. Then I follow on from Liz's street through time. I say, well, Liz has shown you how things have developed over the last 160, 70 years. And that she's provided you with a lot of sources of secondary data. Now, how are you going to get primary data? Could you get primary data to update that study to show what's happening now? And I've given all sorts of fieldwork techniques. I've shown you how to do a smelly map or a stinky map, and or how to do a graffiti map, or how to study the viability of the area as a whole, how to ask a whole series of questions that either you answer or you take round for people who live in the area or who work in the area or who pass through the area to answer. There are a whole lot of different studies. Liz has dealt with photography and field sketching and labeling. She's dealt with developing maps, taking maps from the Ordnance Survey, present and past maps, and then building on them, building your own information onto those maps, adding primary information to a secondary source. So if you're interested in doing something like that, then log on to that street through time. It also, Liz is part of it, is a superb study for urban change. It makes a very good field study. It also makes a good study of changing place, which is part of the spec that I'm involved with, and it'll fit for different parts of different syllabuses from the different boards. So it's useful for everybody. Right. All of you, whichever board you're doing, will have to fill in a proposal form. And you've got to complete the proposal form and attach to the front of your study when you hand it in. Now, bear with me for a moment. I'm going to bring up a proposal form, I hope. Here we are. Your proposal form will look, well, for some of you it'll be exactly like this. For others, it'll look pretty much like this, depending on the board you're doing. You fill in your name and number and you centre name and number. So that was a bit tricky, but here's the form. It will ask you to fill in your candidate name and number, and you have to sign to say that you've obeyed all the rules, and your teacher's got to sign to say you've obeyed all the rules. All very bureaucratic. But then the key sections are, you put in your investigation title, how it links to spec content, the questions that you're going to ask within that title, the focus of your inquiry, really what you're going to look at in detail, and then your plan methodology. I think the plan methodology should be about 5 times as big as that. Well, when you're writing in it, if you're doing it on screen, it will extend. But I think that's the important bit. Your teacher's got to approve it and sign it. But then on that same sheet, or next page of it, is the teacher's marking sheet. Now you should be able to see this before the teacher fills it in. And it's worth looking through this. There are 60 marks available for this whole thing. And you'll see that 10 marks go for introduction and preliminary research. I'll deal with each of these in detail in turn. So 10 marks for the preliminary bit, 15 marks for the field investigation, the methods, the methodology. Now that's the bit that's going to be fundamental to everything you do. And it's worth 15 marks. The biggest mark band is your critical analysis. It's just worth looking through that. To demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the techniques appropriate for analysing field data and information and for representing results, and show ability to select suitable quantitative or qualitative approaches and to apply them. And then to interrogate and critically examine the field data in order to comment on its accuracy. There are 20 marks for that. So out of the 60, a third of them are for that area 3, the critical analysis. So bear that in mind. The final section is drawing conclusions, and that's worth 15 marks. But let's concentrate on the first 3 for now. Introduction and preliminary research, field investigation, critical analysis. Now I've got to get back to my I hope you can still see that. Back to the back to PowerPoint. So the proposal. So your proposal must be complete and attached to the front of your study. The best proposals are tight. I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by tight proposals. Your first line is the title. And I think in your title, you should have a brief reference to the idea that you're testing and a very clear reference to the place or places that you're testing. I'm going to do a study of the changing environment, the changing sensory environment over time in a street through the Ousburn development area. So the idea, changing sensory environment, place, the Ousburn development area. I'm going to do a study of the effect of the redevelopment plan in central Birmingham in the area around New Street Station. Or I am going to study of the way that infiltration changes before, during, and after rainstorm events in the Alwyn Valley in Northumberland. So the idea and the place, simple, clear, precise. Then the second section, you have to link that to the spec. So you say clearly and simply how your idea, how your study links to a specific part of your specification. You can give the number of the section of the spec that you're looking at and a brief reference to the part of the spec, you know, a brief quote from the spec to say what you're looking at. You may well be looking at more than one part of the spec. And a lot of specs, a lot of specifications, the different sections do overlap. They're designed to overlap. So your study may well be looking at overlapping sections. refer to them both or all. In the focus section, the next section, you've got to show how you intend to use and develop your ideas and show how they fit into the wider field of geography, and refer to the big ideas and refer to the references that are giving you the idea. Some theme from your textbook, some theme that you studied in class maybe, or some theme that particularly interests you. And you fit into the big field of geography. That's quite straightforward, varies for each of you. Then, what I think is very important, you've got your main question, your main title. Some people leave it with one main title and can just work through that. Most candidates decide they'll divide their main title into a number of sub-questions, into a number of themes that they're going to develop in turn. I think those themes should be linked. You should all be linked to the main title, maybe well developed. I'll do this basic study, then I'll do this, see how change might happen, then I'll do this to see what the area might be like at some time in the future, whatever. Or I'll look at the cross-section of the valley, I'll look at the different sections of the valley, then I'll look at how water infiltrates in those sections of the valley at a normal time, then I will go up after a storm or after a long period of drought, and I'll repeat it to see how change in circumstances change a process in the valley. Now, in the past, people have suggested that 3 or 4 sub-questions is the best approach. I would suggest now, in this post-COVID time, in this time when you're having to concentrate, having to use your time to the very best possible effect, that perhaps 2 or 3 rather than 3 or 4 sub-questions is best. It's up to you in discussion with your teacher and possibly your school's advisor to decide just exactly how you're going to go about that. But it means you should focus on what's really important for your study and cut out any padding. Then that bit that I said, the methodology section, and I said it should be 4 or 5 times longer than it actually is on here. The methodology section asks you, how are you going to collect your fieldwork? How are you going to collect your data? So I think you need to describe, to list your data collection ideas. And I think you ought to try to have 3 or 4 or 5 forms of data collection. And you must concentrate on primary data. Secondary data that other people have collected and then you want to use, it may well be useful, but you must have primary data. But the methodology section doesn't ask you to do this, but I think you ought to do it. When you're talking about the data you're going to collect, I think you ought to think very carefully about how you're going to present the data. It's no good going out and doing a lot of data collection and thinking, oh, what am I going to do with it? I've got it, now what happens to it? Well, think beforehand, what maps, what graphs, what diagrams, what pictures, what field sketches, what annotation you're going to do. Decide that for each set of data you collect, how you're going to present it. And for when you presented it, how you're going to analyze it. What data analysis techniques you're going to use. Now, I would put those in that proposal form. Here's my data collection technique. Here's how I'm going to present it. Here's how I'm going to analyze it. And I think if you can do that before you start, then you collect your data in a much more realistic, practical way than just collecting lots of data, then wondering what to do with it. And when you present it, you're thinking, how am I going to analyze it? Does this presentation technique lead me into a form of analysis, either a statistical analysis or a qualitative analysis? Think about that when you're doing your proposal. You need a variety of techniques of data collection, but they must be relevant and they must be suitable for the task you're doing. And it's far more important to have a small number of suitable, relevant, focused techniques than to have a variety of techniques for variety's sake. Sometimes at GCSE level, I find teachers encourage their students to do a variety for variety's sake. You've shown this set of data on a bar graph, show the next set of data on a pie graph. But if you wanted to compare those two sets of data, far better to have them both in the same form of presentation. That's more relevant because you could compare them directly. Comparing a bar graph with a pie chart is silly, really. It's doing a technique for the sake of the technique, not for the sake of proving your hypothesis. And again, I think 3 or 4 really well-focused, well-chosen techniques are better than even more shoved in just to make up the numbers, just to show variety. So that is your planning form filled in. When you come to write it up, and this is going to guide your data collection. When you come to write it up, in your plan, you need to say, where did you go? Well, you may not have gone anywhere. You might have done it all from the internet. Where did you study? What was the place? Why did you go there? Why did you choose that? Why did you show? Why were those boundaries relevant? Why was that cross-section relevant? So locate the place. That's why you really need a map. Your teacher probably knows the area. When your teacher comes to mark your study, they probably know the area that you're talking about. When the moderator comes to moderate it, and the moderator has the final say, the moderator almost certainly doesn't know your area. So you need to help the moderator to locate it precisely for the moderator. So where did you go and why did you go there? What were you hoping to show or discover or prove? And how did you prepare? This is the introduction. Do you remember when I showed you the introductory sections worth 10 marks? And the introductory section also includes a review of the literature. You could just quote from your textbook. This paragraph in the textbook gave me my idea that I was going to test. Well, that's fine. It's a bit limited, but it's okay. If you're aiming to get every possible mark, then as well as your textbook, go to more specialized geography books. Or go to websites that are linked to your study. Go to geographical journals, which in actual fact is a hope, but unfortunately, geographical journals are difficult to get hold of. Your teacher may still have access to the local university library. You may be able to find some journals that are what's called open access on the internet, but it's quite tricky. You can get background papers about what you're doing. Some local authority plans describing what's planned for an area, or newspaper articles describing an issue, or something produced by a company that's investing in an area, or possibly, there are local elections coming up in May. It may well be that the candidates in the local elections have views which they put in their little leaflets to send out about the issue that you're involved in. I know around here, our one particular party brings out a book, a leaflet called their Focus newsletter. It's not a party I support, but their focus letters are brilliant. They really deal with a lot of local issues. And I think some of those local issues may well be what you want to study, and you may well quote something from them. It's quotes from interested parties. Your mum might have a real interest in something. Get a quote from her. She can write you a quote. You can call that the literature. Then you can call her a local person. A person with a keen interest in this said. That can be part of your literature. That can be what started you off. You only tell them it's your mum that you're quoting, but your mum's as important as anybody in the area. But if it's not your mum using, if you are using a book, use precise chapter and page references. Don't just put a title of the book in. But keep focused on the topic, stay relevant, don't overdo it. Don't bother writing a generic regional history. And if you do quote directly from the sources, be precise. I say, if you quote more than 2 or 3 sentences, you're probably overdoing it. You know, a paragraph, quote a paragraph if you wish, but don't use more than your share of your word limit. And please, whatever sources you use, acknowledge them. Your mum might say, well, you're not putting my quote in unless you quote me by name. But whatever book it is you use, quote it. Don't pretend that it's your own original thoughts. You get credit for linking in to this whole literature, the whole study of this area in the past. And keep a record of the sources you use. You've got to put a bibliography in. There are different ways of doing it. Any one of those is acceptable, but be consistent. And then the key thing that I want to really emphasize finally, you've got to describe your methods of data collection. And just how much detail have you got to go into? When people are marking this section, the key thing they have to ask is, if I follow the description of the method provided here, could I repeat that data collection? You've got to tell the people who are reading it what you did, so that if they want to repeat it, they could go out and they could repeat it. You've got to be clear and you've got to be precise. But you're addressing other experienced geographers. You're addressing your teacher or the head of department or whoever it is in the school that's going to mark it. And you're addressing the moderator, who is a very experienced geographer, whoever it is, there's a whole team of them, but they're all very experienced geography teachers. You're not writing for a little year 7 student. You're writing for a grown-up geographer. So don't be patronizing. Don't be too detailed, too fussy. If you use a clinometer, you don't need to draw a clinometer and draw little diagrams of how you held it against the ranging rod, and then you looked up the clinometer and your friend held the other ranging rod, and then you moved up the hill and past the other. You don't need all that detail. Say we did a kilometer study using a kilometer and ranging rods, 2 people. That's all. You don't need to overdo it. Most people are fine with describing how they carried out the collection. What a lot of people forget is, how did you choose your sample? Now, you're all going to have to sample. That's what doing a study is about. You're going to select a bit of a much bigger area, a bit of reality. So how did you sample? Why did you use that technique? Did it work? Could it have been improved? And yes, almost certainly it could have been improved. Your sampling isn't going to be perfect because you haven't got the time. And you You haven't got the resources, maybe. And there are all sorts of problems. And everybody gets those. But the best students are aware of their shortcomings and explain them and justify them, justify why they had to take shortcuts. You can't be expected to spend the whole of your summer holidays collecting data. You have to do what you can do. And was your particular form of sampling forced on you by COVID restrictions? I think we'll get a lot of this and explain how you cope with COVID restrictions. And of course, when you're explaining how you cope with COVID restrictions, that brings in the ethics of fieldwork and the health and safety aspects. You had to protect yourself, but you also had to make sure that you didn't risk spreading COVID. Okay, by the time you're doing it, COVID may be a much less serious threat than it has been in the past, but you've still got to be aware of it, and you've still got to take precautions and explain those precautions both as an important part of your sampling, an important part of your ethics, an important part of your health and safety, all of which you're going to get credit for. Another thing I think more people could do is to pre-test their data collection techniques. If you're going to do a questionnaire, don't print out 50 copies of it and go out and start questioning straight away. And then finally got a problem with it. Far better to do 2 copies of your test, of your questionnaire, to test it on 2 people and to see if they understand it. And if your questions produce the right kind of answers. Or do people not understand the questions? Or are the words that you've used, the technical geography words, that aren't understood by the general public? I mean, the one that I've seen most often is people talk about convenience and comparison shops. And you ask the general public about convenience shops, they're really not quite sure what you mean. Or comparison shops. And again, you've got to explain it to them all. So make sure that you're using language that can be understood and language that produces the kind of data that you can then work with. And make sure that your questions don't give away the answer you're looking for. Your questions have got to be unbiased. So if you do your pre-test and then find out that one of your questions doesn't work, change it. And that's brilliant. It's really good for you, because if you have to change a question, you then explain in your write-up, well, I did a pre-test and this question didn't work, and I changed it for this because, and that gives you credit for being able to analyze and criticize your own work and show that you came up with solutions to problems. Perhaps also when you do your data collection or your sampling, what alternatives could you have used? And why did you reject those? And why did you choose the one that you did? It's all good stuff. It's all going to get you marks. And it's all going to give you pride if you do this and you really can show what, so academic skills, it's going to make you feel good. And in your write-up, you've got to discuss the overall success. If you do say, if I'd had more time, I would have collected more data, you're really saying my sampling technique wasn't very good. So be a bit more thoughtful than that. And don't just blame the weather, because it's England. And the weather's always going to be dodgy. A friend of mine took her class to the south coast of Swanage just when what storm was it was blowing in? They'd booked 4 days into a field, or 3 nights into a field centre. They had to come home. They missed the whole thing. So, be aware of weather problems, but don't blame the weather. How does COVID change everything? you'll probably have less time to work on your NEA because your teachers are going to want to make sure that you work on your content, your in-class teaching. So perhaps you'll not be able to collect quite so much data as you did people in the past. Or perhaps it won't be quite so elaborate. Ofqual's not yet said they'll make allowances for that, but I'm quite sure that moderators and principal moderators will be aware of making allowances for COVID. Health and safety considerations will come into this. But even if they relax the rules on primary and secondary data, they're still going to demand some primary data collection. Yes, by all means, use some secondary data, but you must use some primary data. But you can collect primary data online by sending out questionnaires, recording real-time data from webcams. A webcam, for instance, might be put in some key part of a town. You might have access to it to see how many people walk up down the high street at different times of day and night. That's just there filming it. It's not selecting data. If you go and abstract data from the webcam, then that is primary data collection. If you go to an estate agent and ask for some details about houses in the area, you're doing something on the price of housing in different areas, and you collect a whole series of leaflets from the estate agent, or take their leaflets down from the internet, take their stuff down from the internet, and then you abstract data from their leaflets or their websites, then you are collecting the data. It becomes primary data when you become selective of their data. Because it's data that's been produced, their leaflets have been produced for something entirely different, not for geography fieldwork. You've gone to the trouble of abstracting the data from there. You're the original collector of it. As I said before, places have changed, the world's changed, contemporary urban environments have changed because of COVID, and they're changing again as we come out. It presents many topics for NEAs. During lockdown, lots of geography teachers have become much more adapted to using tech in their teaching. And from the students who I know, many have developed a lot of new tech-linked learning and research skills. So please use technology as much as you possibly can. You're the leaders in a lot of aspects of technology. Make use of it. Be resilient, be prepared, be flexible. And be brilliant. It's fabulous as a teacher or as a moderator or as a chief examiner to see some of the work that some students do. Some of my most exciting times in teaching was seeing the excellent work that youngsters did. Sometimes it was the brilliant students who did the brilliant work. Sometimes it was the students who you hadn't really noticed up till then who did the brilliant work, who, because they had a chance to be themselves, their work was brilliant. So sparkle, shine. And let's just see. My time, I'm running over time, and I've got sections on presentation of data and on analysis of data. And I'm going to go through these very quickly. Present your data in variety. Sometimes it'll be tables, sometimes it'll be texts, whatever. But sometimes you'll embed it in your text, sometimes you do it in the appendix. What you do doesn't matter, but do make your text and your data presentation flow. The person who reads it has to be able to follow it through without flicking this way and that way, or if they do have to turn to an appendix to the back, they know exactly where they're turning to. It's got to be easy to navigate. You don't get marks, I don't think, for ease of navigation, but it does put the reader in a good mood if it's easy to read. It's got to be clear. You need variety. Include at least one map that you've drawn to show your place. Present some of your raw data, but it's important to do it in process form because that draws out trends, relationships, and connections between different aspects of the data. Don't just stick it in and expect the reader to do all the work for you. You've got to do the work for them and show them the trends, relationships, and connections within your data. You don't need to stuff all your completed copies in any way. You're going to be doing it online, so you're going to be doing tech, so you're not going to have lots of sheets, lots of pages to put in. Do you put all your data in and then write all your analysis, or do you put one piece of data in, then analyze that, then another piece, and analyze that? It's up to you. Whichever you think helps it to flow and to be understandable. And now, this is really important. You're expected to do some statistical analysis. And I know some people will be saying, oh, I'm hopeless at stats, I can't do maths. Well, you've got to this stage. Don't be soft. Of course you can do some maths. It may be simple maths, it may be simple stats, but you can do it. You can do percentages. You can do dispersion diagrams. You can work at averages. You can even know the difference between means, medians, and modes. And if you can't just remember how to do percentages, if you forget what the formula is, ask somebody and they'll write the formula down for you, and then you do the work. But there are lots of simple mathematical techniques or statistical techniques that you all should be able to do. Do them clearly. Do them and then explain what they show. It's that interpretation that's key. But then most of you should be able to go on and do the sophisticated techniques, the Spearman's or the chi-squared. But it's no good doing the sum if you can't tell people what it shows, what the significance of the results is. So this is key. It's no good saying, I've done the Spearman's rank correlation and I've come up with a figure of 7.3, so I've proved what I set out to show. You've got to say that figure of 0.73 rather was a positive correlation, which shows this. It was a fairly strong correlation, which shows this. And it was, when I checked it with the tables, it was more than 95% certain that this link hadn't arisen by chance. So you've got to say three things about your Spearman result: the strength, the direction, and the likelihood of it occurring by chance. So you must do that. Don't just do the technique and then leave it for the reader to work it out. Draw your conclusions. You can draw conclusions about the place you are studying, or you can draw conclusions about the ideas or concepts that you were testing. But in your conclusions, you must refer back to the aims and objectives that you set out with and the literature you base your ideas on. And if your ideas have worked out, if you prove them, great. And if they've not worked, if it just doesn't work, great, because then you can explain why they didn't. You can explain, was it your idea that was wrong? Was it your data collection techniques that were wrong? Just what went wrong? And have you proved something else instead? Can you alter your idea because you've shown that your first idea was wrong in this situation? The best of both worlds is when your final conclusion say, well, actually, mostly I was right. Most of my conclusions worked, but there were one or two places where they didn't. So why didn't it work in those one or two places? And then you can develop your ideas further. You can explain that. It's explaining the anomalies that's often the most interesting and important part. But in your final section, that final 15-mark section on conclusions, you have to review the whole process of data collection, presentation, analysis. And all of those will have contributed to the final reliability of your inquiry. If your data collection was wrong in the first place, your presentation would mean nothing and your analysis would be wrong. So you can trace back any problems through your whole process. And that contributes to final reliability of your inquiry. And perhaps in your conclusions, you can assess how the inquiry could be taken forward. You know, if I was here next year, or if I was a student doing this next year, having proved this, I could then go on to final point. Our spec says the inquiry should be about 3,000 to 4,000 words in length. We don't penalize anybody for going under or over that. If you're below 2,500 words, you've almost certainly not done enough detail. You're just not, you can't do enough unless you're very concise and very precise, often very mathematical. You've probably not done enough detail. If you're above 5,000 words, you're probably taking too much time and neglecting other important parts of your A-level course, either other parts of your geography course or your other subjects or your social life. It's important to keep your social life going as well. But you won't be penalised in terms of mark loss if you do exceed that 3,000 to 4,000 figure. And I was one of these people. I was asked to produce a specimen inquiry, to write one for myself when we were first setting this up. And I was asked to write an inquiry that would get between 55 and 60 marks out of 60. And, you know, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it without, and still keep below 4,000 words. If I want to make sure I hit every statement in the mark scheme, I had to go over 4,000 words. But I didn't go over 5,000. I think I took about 4,500 words. And when it was marked, I got 57 or something. But be sensible. And if you have gone a bit over, if you have written 4,500, don't feel you have to go through it again and take out 500 words. That's wasting more time. So be sensible. Don't overdo it, but make sure you've written enough and make sure that you can tick all the statements on that mark scheme at the end. And those are my final tips. Tightly focused. Limited number of hypotheses and lead on from data collection to presentation to analysis. Choose a good sampling technique. Make sure there's a strong spatial component. Make sure you're very closely linked to a place, a small, well-defined geographical area. Use a range of graphical techniques and statistical tools. Analyze and interpret, don't just describe your results. Embed your illustration within the text. That's the idea of flowing. And think critically about the geographical context that you're working in. Good luck, be original, and be brilliant. And you're in a difficult situation, but be flexible and be resilient. And learning to be flexible and resilient is such a key life skill. I wish you luck with it. Thank you very much.